In the autumn of 1941, behind closed doors in the Imperial Japanese Naval Headquarters in Tokyo, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto made a declaration that would echo through the halls of naval history. Standing before a gathering of senior officers, he gestured toward classified blueprints spread across a mahogany table and spoke words that dripped with absolute certainty. "This ship cannot be sunk by any weapon in existence." The room fell silent. These weren't the musings of a reckless dreamer. This was the commander-in-chief of Japan's combined fleet, a man known for his calculating pragmatism, making a claim that defied centuries of naval warfare wisdom. Every sailor knew the ocean's fundamental truth: anything that floats can sink. Yet here stood Japan's most respected admiral, declaring they had built the impossible.
The ship in question was the Yamato, and calling it merely a battleship would be like calling Mount Everest merely a hill. At over 70,000 tons fully loaded, it displaced more water than any warship ever constructed. Its main guns, 9 massive 18-inch cannons, could hurl shells weighing as much as a small automobile over distances of 26 miles. The armor protecting its vital spaces measured up to 16 inches thick, enough steel to stop any shell fired by any enemy ship afloat. But the numbers, as staggering as they were, told only part of the story. To the Japanese military establishment, the Yamato represented something far beyond engineering achievement. It embodied the nation's challenge to Western naval supremacy, a steel declaration that Japan had not only caught up to the great powers, but had surpassed them. The empire had poured resources equivalent to building dozens of smaller warships into this single vessel. Entire steel mills had been commandeered. Thousands of workers had labored in absolute secrecy for years. The financial investment alone could have funded a small war. Yet, as Admiral Yamamoto's words hung in that conference room, a troubling question lingered unspoken. If this floating fortress truly was unsinkable, if Japan had genuinely revolutionized naval warfare and built an invincible weapon, why did some officers in that very room shift uncomfortably in their chairs? Why did a few exchange glances that betrayed something closer to anxiety than triumph? Perhaps they sensed what history would soon prove, that confidence, no matter how well armored, makes for a dangerous foundation when the rules of war are changing faster than anyone realizes. The proclamation of invincibility didn't emerge from a single moment, but became a chorus among Japan's naval elite throughout the early war years. Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito, who would later command the Yamato's final voyage, once told his staff officers that enemy shells would bounce off her hull like pebbles against a fortress wall. Captain Kosaku Aroga, the ship's final commander, reportedly told new crew members during their first day aboard that they were standing on a piece of Japan that can never be conquered. These weren't idle boasts whispered in sake houses. These were official assessments from men whose careers depended on cold calculation and tactical reality. The confidence radiated beyond the wardrooms and into Japan's broader war strategy. Naval planners designed entire battle scenarios around the Yamato's presumed invulnerability.
The ship would sail into enemy formations, absorb punishment that would destroy lesser vessels, and deliver devastating broadsides that would shatter any fleet foolish enough to engage it. Staff officers spoke of it as a mobile fortress, an island of Japanese territory that could project power anywhere in the Pacific. In their minds, they had solved warfare's oldest problem: how to create an unstoppable force. When officers gave tours of the completed battleship to government officials and carefully selected journalists, the reactions bordered on religious awe. Men stood beneath the massive gun turrets, each one weighing more than an entire destroyer, and struggled to comprehend the scale. The ship stretched longer than 3 football fields. Standing on the deck felt less like being on a vessel and more like standing on a city block that happened to float. One naval inspector wrote in his confidential report that seeing the Yamato made him believe Japan has created something beyond the reach of our enemy's imagination.
Yet here lies the haunting contradiction that would define the Yamato's legacy. If this steel leviathan truly embodied invincibility, if the finest minds in Japanese naval engineering had genuinely built something that could not be destroyed, then how did it end up 350 meters beneath the surface of the East China Sea, entombed with over 3,000 souls? The answer lay not in what the Yamato was, but in what its creators failed to see coming. On November 4, 1937, in a massive dry dock at the Kure Naval Arsenal, construction began on a project so classified that even saying its name aloud in public could land a worker in a military prison. The Japanese government understood that building the world's largest battleship would attract attention, and attention was the last thing they wanted. So they constructed an elaborate theater of deception that would last 4 years. Enormous canvas screens, tall as apartment buildings, surrounded the dry dock on all sides. Workers arriving each morning passed through multiple security checkpoints where guards confiscated cameras, notepads, and anything that could record information. The workforce was compartmentalized with ruthless efficiency. Welders working on the hull never saw the gun turrets being assembled. Engine room specialists never glimpsed the armor plating. Each team knew only their specific section, their particular assignment, nothing more. If a man couldn't describe what he didn't know, he couldn't reveal it to foreign spies.
The deception surrounding the Yamato's construction extended far beyond the shipyard walls. Japanese intelligence agencies deliberately leaked false information to Western naval attachés, claiming they were building 2 smaller battleships instead of one colossal vessel. To further conceal the truth, they built fake construction projects nearby to mislead aerial reconnaissance, so that when American intelligence officers examined photographs of Kure, they saw nothing more than routine naval activity. Behind those towering canvas screens, however, an immense economic sacrifice was unfolding. The Yamato consumed enough steel to build 4 fleet carriers, or 20 destroyers, with entire towns' worth of metal and labor funneled into its creation. Special steel mills operated at full capacity for years, producing armor plates of unprecedented thickness, while the budget overruns became a state secret, too enormous for public disclosure. Yet Japan's military leadership considered the cost justified. They believed they were forging not merely a warship, but a symbol of Japan's technological supremacy, a declaration that their nation had ascended to stand among the world's great powers. When the Yamato finally slid into the water on August 8, 1940, its hidden specifications defied imagination. Armor 16 inches thick, roughly the height of a small child, encased its vital machinery spaces. It was more than protection. It was a statement of invincibility, a proclamation that nothing afloat could ever penetrate its steel walls.
The Yamato's main battery told an even more audacious story of power and ambition. Mounted within 3 colossal turrets were 9 18-inch guns, the largest naval rifles ever placed on a warship. Each shell weighed 3,200 pounds, heavier than a compact car, and could be hurled more than 26 miles with pinpoint accuracy, capable of striking a target the size of a building. The sheer force of a single turret firing was enough to shift the ship sideways in the water, and during test firings, crewmen reported feeling the steel deck flex beneath their boots from the shock wave. Life aboard the Yamato was life inside a floating fortress, a self-contained city of steel housing over 2,500 men. Beneath its armored decks lay an intricate maze of compartments, passageways, and battle stations designed for efficiency and survival. The ship carried enough fuel, ammunition, and provisions to operate independently for weeks, while below the waterline, engineers installed sophisticated anti-torpedo bulges and watertight sections intended to contain flooding and keep the vessel afloat even after multiple hits. It was a masterpiece of engineering built on the logic of an older era, one where naval battles were fought between mighty ships exchanging thunderous broadsides. Yet within every welded seam and riveted plate lay a fatal assumption that the age of battleship supremacy still reigned. In truth, naval warfare was transforming beyond recognition, and the Yamato, born of steel and pride, entered a world that no longer played by the rules its creators understood.
The Yamato's commissioning on December 16, 1941, just 9 days after the attack on Pearl Harbor, carried symbolism far deeper than mere military might. Even its name revealed the ship's greater purpose. Yamato was the ancient poetic term for Japan itself, evoking the nation's mythic origins and divine destiny. Naming the world's most powerful battleship after the homeland was no routine naval tradition. It was a declaration of identity and pride, a statement that Japan's spirit had been forged in steel. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto took a personal interest in every detail of the ship's strategic role, envisioning the Yamato as the invincible centerpiece of Japan's naval power, a floating fortress that would anchor fleet formations while smaller vessels maneuvered around it. It embodied decades of battleship doctrine rooted in Japan's victory in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904, a philosophy that placed faith in big guns and heavy armor. Yet even as the crew prepared for duty and the ship gleamed in completion, cracks began to show in that grand vision. Across the Pacific, the United States was mass-producing aircraft carriers at a staggering rate, an industrial shift that signaled a revolution in naval warfare. The very carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor had already proven a sobering truth. Future battles would be decided not by ships exchanging broadsides, but by aircraft striking from hundreds of miles away.
Japanese naval leadership witnessed the rapid transformation of warfare, but could not bring themselves to fully accept what it meant. Their faith in battleship supremacy ran too deep, anchored in decades of doctrine, tradition, and pride. Generations of officers had built their careers on the belief that big guns and heavy armor defined naval mastery. At the Naval Academy in Etajima, the art of battleship engagement was taught as the highest form of strategy, the ultimate expression of command and discipline. To shift toward a carrier-based doctrine would have meant admitting that everything they had learned and believed in, the very foundation of Japan's naval identity, had become obsolete overnight. And so they clung to the Yamato. The ship ceased to be just a weapon. It became a national symbol, an emblem of strength and honor, too sacred to question. But this emotional attachment to steel and symbolism would prove more dangerous than any enemy attack. For a vessel designed to dominate the seas, the Yamato spent much of the Pacific War anchored in safety, consuming fuel and waiting for battles that never came. The reason wasn't technical, it was psychological. Japan's naval command feared losing their masterpiece. During the critical Battle of Midway in June 1942, the Yamato, carrying Admiral Yamamoto himself, remained far from the fight while American dive bombers annihilated Japan's carrier fleet. The battle that broke Japan's naval dominance occurred without the Unsinkable ship ever firing a shot. This pattern would continue. As destroyers and cruisers fought and died in the violent night battles around Guadalcanal, the Yamato stayed idle at Truk Lagoon, Japan's main anchorage. It sat there so often, untouched by the chaos of war, that sailors from other ships mockingly nicknamed it the Yamato Hotel, a bitter symbol of comfort and inaction, while others fought and bled across the Pacific. The nickname Yamato Hotel stung because it reflected a painful truth. Many junior officers aboard the ship grew restless and disillusioned as they watched the war unfold from a safe distance. They had trained endlessly for battle, prepared for the decisive engagement that would prove the Yamato's supremacy. Yet month after month passed with nothing but routine patrols and idle anchorage duty. While crews on other ships faced the brutal realities of naval combat, testing their courage, their skills, and their damage control systems under fire, the men of the Yamato remained untested, their drills mechanical, and their purpose uncertain. Beneath the pride of serving on Japan's most powerful battleship lingered a quiet frustration. They were spectators to a war they were built to fight. For Japan's high command, the situation had become an impossible dilemma. The Yamato was too valuable a symbol to risk in ordinary combat. Yet keeping it safe meant it contributed almost nothing to Japan's crumbling strategic position. Every gallon of fuel it consumed while idle was one less for carriers and destroyers desperately fighting at the front. The ship that had been built to secure victory had in practice become a monument, massive, magnificent, and utterly irrelevant. A towering relic of a naval doctrine already fading into history. By the autumn of 1944, Japan's strategic situation had collapsed from troubling to catastrophic. The turning point came with the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June, a clash so one-sided that American pilots would later nickname it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. In a single devastating day, Japan lost 3 aircraft carriers and more than 600 naval aircraft, wiping out an air arm that had taken years to build. The empire's once formidable naval aviation strength vanished in hours of brutal aerial combat, leaving a void that could never be filled. 3 months later, Japan staked everything on the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history, and a desperate attempt to halt the American reconquest of the Philippines. For the first time, the Yamato saw real action, unleashing its colossal guns against American escort carriers off Samar Island. For a fleeting moment, the super battleship performed exactly as intended. Its shells thundered across the ocean, forcing smaller U.S. ships to flee behind thick smokescreens. Yet, even that brief success couldn't disguise the scale of the disaster. When the smoke cleared, Japan had lost 4 aircraft carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. The Imperial Navy, once the pride of Asia, had ceased to exist as a meaningful fighting force. From that point onward, the American advance became unstoppable. Island after island fell: Saipan, Tinian, Guam, each one bringing U.S. bombers closer to the Japanese homeland. By early 1945, with Iwo Jima captured and the invasion of Okinawa underway, the end was clear. The Americans weren't just winning, they were dismantling Japan's defensive perimeter piece by piece, and nothing remained strong enough to stop them. Behind closed doors in Tokyo, the mood among naval leadership shifted from grim confidence to desperate fatalism. Fuel was running critically low as American submarines choked Japan's shipping lanes, strangling oil imports from the Dutch East Indies, and the once mighty combined fleet had been reduced to scattered, damaged, fuel-starved remnants hiding in distant anchorages. Worst of all, Japan's carrier force, the weapon that had dominated the early months of the war, was effectively gone. The few carriers still afloat had neither aircraft nor trained pilots to launch. In that context, the question haunted every briefing: what purpose did the Yamato serve anymore? Moored at Kure Naval Base and protected only by anti-aircraft batteries and camouflage nets, she consumed precious fuel while sitting squarely within reach of American reconnaissance and attack, less a fighting ship than a conspicuous target. Pressure mounted for a dramatic gesture, however futile, and on April 5, 1945, Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito convened senior officers to outline Operation Tengo, a one-way mission to steam the Yamato and a small escort to Okinawa, beach her as an immobile gun platform, and fight until destroyed or out of ammunition. There would be no return.
The silence that followed Vice Admiral Ito's announcement hung heavy in the room. After several tense seconds, Captain Atsushi Oi, a senior staff officer, finally broke it, his voice steady but edged with disbelief. He called the plan what it was: a meaningless sacrifice, a futile gesture that would waste thousands of lives and destroy the Navy's last great warship. Around the table, other officers nodded grimly. They had all done the math. The Yamato would need to travel more than 300 miles through waters teeming with American submarines and within range of powerful carrier task forces. With no air cover, because Japan had none left, the ship would be spotted within hours and overwhelmed by superior numbers. This wasn't strategy, it was a death march. Even Admiral Ito himself seemed conflicted as he delivered the orders. Witnesses later recalled him acknowledging the mission's near-certain doom, but he explained the crushing political pressure that left him no choice. On Okinawa, the Japanese army was being annihilated by American forces and had begun publicly questioning the Navy's will to fight. Even Emperor Hirohito had asked what the fleet intended to do. The demand for action, no matter how hopeless, had become impossible to ignore. And so, despite the protests, preparations began. Sailors filled the ship's magazines with every remaining shell. Engineers calculated fuel with precision, loading only enough for a one-way voyage to Okinawa. In the dim light of their quarters, crewmen wrote farewell letters home, letters they knew would never be delivered. A few tried to transfer off the ship, unwilling to die in what they saw as a pointless gesture, but most stayed. Whether driven by duty, pride, or resignation, they accepted the truth. They were sailing toward death.
On April 6 at 3 p.m., the Yamato slipped from Tokuyama anchorage, escorted by the light cruiser Yahagi and 8 destroyers, and as the formation turned southwest toward Okinawa, everyone aboard understood the grim truth. They were steaming toward annihilation. The only questions were how long they'd survive, and who, if anyone, would see the sunrise on April 8th. Almost immediately, the American submarine USS Threadfin spotted the task force and sent a crisp radio report with coordinates, course, and speed. Within hours, Admiral Raymond Spruance and Vice Admiral Mark Mitscher had the picture they needed. Mitscher, commanding Task Force 58, chose not restraint but overwhelming force. He ordered every available plane from his carriers to launch, torpedo bombers, dive bombers, fighters, intending a simultaneous crushing strike. Nearly 400 aircraft were readied, though weather and mechanical problems would reduce the actual attacking force to roughly 280 planes, still more than enough.
The strike plan was executed with precision, born of experience and calculation. American commanders had studied the Yamato's design in detail, and their attack reflected that knowledge. Torpedo bombers would strike first in coordinated waves from both sides, ensuring the battleship could not turn fast enough to evade. Dive bombers would target the superstructure and deck armor, while fighter aircraft strafed the anti-aircraft batteries to suppress the fierce defensive fire that made Japanese ships so dangerous to attack. Each pilot was thoroughly briefed on the Yamato's strengths and weaknesses, its 16-inch armor belts, its 18-inch guns, and the fatal vulnerabilities beneath the waterline. They were told to focus their strikes, to saturate defenses, to leave the ship no moment of recovery between waves. At 10 a.m. on April 7th, engines roared to life across multiple carrier decks. One after another, aircraft catapulted into the sky, forming attack groups that banked southward toward the Yamato's last known position. Every pilot understood the enormity of what lay ahead. They were about to assault the largest, most heavily armed warship ever built. But they also knew they held the decisive advantage. The Yamato's guns could not bring down hundreds of planes before the storm reached her. coordination and sheer numbers would triumph over armor and firepower. The hunt was on. At 12:32 p.m., lookouts aboard the Yamato spotted the first wave of American aircraft approaching from the south. Within seconds, alarms blared through the ship's steel corridors, sending crewmen racing to their battle stations. Captain Kosaku Aruga ordered evasive maneuvers, and the massive battleship began a hard turn to port, engines straining under full power. The escorting destroyers shifted into defensive formation, their guns joining in a thunderous chorus. The Yamato's anti-aircraft batteries erupted, filling the sky with black bursts of shrapnel. The roar was deafening, dozens of guns firing at once, shell casings clattering across the decks, officers shouting over the chaos. For a fleeting moment, it seemed the wall of fire might hold. Several American planes broke off their runs, trailing smoke, while others spiraled down in flames. The gunners' training and the ship's formidable arsenal were performing exactly as intended, but the storm had only just begun.
Then the first torpedoes struck. Two slammed into the Yamato's port side almost simultaneously, sending massive columns of water towering higher than the ship's own superstructure. The entire vessel shuddered violently, metal groaning under the impact. Below decks, damage control teams immediately reported flooding in several compartments. For the moment, the situation was contained. The Yamato's anti-torpedo bulges absorbed much of the blast energy, just as designed. Watertight doors sealed automatically, and pumps roared to life to remove the invading seawater. The ship developed a slight list to port, but remained very much alive and fighting. But that was only the beginning. Even as repair crews battled rising water and smoke below deck, lookouts shouted new warnings, more aircraft approaching from multiple directions. The second wave was already diving in, followed almost instantly by a third. The sky above filled with aircraft, a relentless swarm unlike anything anyone aboard had ever seen. The Yamato was about to endure what no battleship in history had faced, a continuous, coordinated aerial onslaught with no pause, no escape, and no mercy. By 1:30 p.m., the outcome was no longer in doubt. American pilots had identified the ship's critical weakness and exploited it without hesitation, focusing every torpedo run on the same side. Each hit drove the list deeper, tilting the massive vessel farther and farther to port. 5 degrees became 10, then 15. Anti-aircraft crews struggled to aim their guns as the deck tilted beneath their feet. Water poured through ruptured armor plates faster than pumps could manage, flooding compartment after compartment, despite the ship's elaborate watertight design. Captain Aruga ordered counter-flooding of starboard compartments in a desperate attempt to stabilize the ship, but it was futile. The damage was too extensive, the strikes too concentrated. Electrical systems began to fail as seawater shorted out wiring deep within the hull. Fires erupted in multiple sections, smoke rolling across the decks as explosions echoed through the corridors. The proud, immaculate fortress of steel was being torn apart, piece by piece. And every man aboard knew the inevitable had begun.
At 2:05 p.m., with the list approaching 30 degrees, Admiral Ito gave his final order: all hands abandon ship.
Many crew members trapped below decks never received the message. Others reached the main deck only to find themselves on a slope too steep to climb. Men slid across tilting steel plates into the ocean. The destroyers moved in, desperately trying to rescue survivors, but the Yamato was capsizing too quickly. At 2:23 p.m., the forward magazines detonated. The explosion was visible from over 200 miles away, a mushroom cloud rising thousands of feet into the sky. When the smoke cleared, the Yamato had completely disappeared beneath the surface. The ship that admirals had proclaimed unsinkable had taken less than 2 hours to destroy once the attack began. Of the 2,778 crew members aboard, only 269 survived. Vice Admiral Ito and Captain Aruga went down with their ship, as did the confidence that steel and armor could overcome the fundamental transformation that had reshaped naval warfare forever.
The destruction of the Yamato was not a failure of engineering. It was a failure of strategic vision. Every aspect that made the ship formidable had been optimized for the wrong kind of warfare. The armor that could deflect battleship shells offered no protection against torpedoes detonating below the waterline. The enormous guns that could destroy enemy ships from 26 miles away could not elevate high enough to target aircraft effectively. The ship's complex system of watertight compartments, designed to contain flooding from a few shell hits, could not withstand 8 or more torpedoes striking the same side of the hull. American pilots, having learned painful lessons from previous battles, adapted their tactics with deadly precision. They focused all torpedo runs on the Yamato's port side, knowing that once the first hits caused a list, each successive strike would worsen it. As the battleship tilted, water flooded compartments that would have remained sealed if the ship were level. In effect, the Yamato's own massive weight became a weapon against itself. The American attack was executed with flawless coordination. Wave after wave arrived with almost no pause, giving Japanese damage control teams no chance to recover. Fighter planes strafed the decks, forcing gunners to take cover, while dive bombers crippled the ship's fire control and communications. It was a display of integrated warfare carried out with brutal efficiency. After the war, both Japanese and American naval experts agreed that no battleship could have survived such an assault. The question was not whether the Yamato was poorly built, but whether battleships still had a place in modern warfare, now ruled by aircraft carriers. Admiral Mitcher himself concluded that the attack on the Yamato confirmed what Pearl Harbor and Midway had already shown. The age of the battleship was over, permanently. Japan had built the ultimate weapon for a style of warfare that had already become obsolete. They designed the Yamato to win battles against other battleships in decisive fleet engagements, the kind of combat that naval theorists had anticipated since the early 20th century. But by 1945, those theoretical battles would never happen. Naval supremacy belonged to whoever controlled the air, and no amount of armor could change that fundamental reality. In the hours following the sinking, American destroyers circled the debris field, while Japanese destroyers frantically searched for survivors. The scene was apocalyptic, oil slicks burning on the water surface, debris scattered across miles of ocean, and hundreds of men clinging to wreckage or swimming in the open sea. the escort destroyer Fuyutsuki managed to rescue 269 survivors from the Yamato, along with survivors from other ships in the task force. Out of nearly 2,800 men who had sailed aboard the battleship just hours earlier, barely 10% lived to see nightfall. Vice Admiral Ito's body was never recovered. True to naval tradition, he had remained on the bridge as the ship capsized, choosing to go down with his command rather than abandon the men under his leadership. Captain Aruga made the same choice, last seen strapped to his command chair as water engulfed the bridge. Chief Gunnery Officer Nomura refused evacuation, staying at his post to the end. These weren't aberrations. Dozens of officers made similar decisions, viewing survival as dishonor when their ship and their men were lost. The debate over Operation Tengo's justification began immediately and continues among historians today. Was this a brave last stand, a demonstration of samurai spirit and unwillingness to surrender without fighting? Or was this a criminal waste of lives, sending thousands of men to certain death for no military purpose whatsoever? Surviving crew members held conflicting views. Some expressed pride in having participated in the Yamato's final mission, believing their sacrifice demonstrated Japanese fighting spirit. Others, particularly those who survived decades into peacetime, questioned whether their friends died for anything meaningful or simply to satisfy political pressure and save face for leadership.
Families of the dead faced particular anguish. Many received only vague notifications that their loved ones had died in action, with no details about how or where. The Japanese government, desperate to maintain morale as the war situation deteriorated, censored information about the disaster. Mothers and wives spent weeks uncertain whether their sons and husbands had perished or might still be alive as prisoners. Some families didn't learn the full truth about the Yamato's fate until after Japan's surrender in August. The human tragedy of Operation Tengo extends beyond the death toll. It encompasses the survivors who carried guilt for living when shipmates died, the families who lost fathers and sons to a mission that accomplished nothing, and the broader question of leadership, sending men knowingly to their deaths for symbolic rather than strategic reasons. The Yamato rests today in 1,120 feet of water in the East China Sea, approximately 200 miles north of Okinawa. Deep-sea exploration teams located the wreck in 1985, finding it split into several major sections scattered across the ocean floor. The bow section sits relatively intact, massive gun turrets still recognizable despite decades of corrosion. The stern section lies separated, a testament to the violence of that final explosion. Smaller debris, personal effects, equipment, shell casings litter the surrounding seabed. The wreck site is officially designated a war grave, protected by Japanese law, though unauthorized expeditions have recovered artifacts over the years. In Kure, the city where the Yamato was built, the Yamato Museum opened in 2005 to commemorate the ship and the men who served aboard. The centerpiece is a massive 1:10 scale model, over 26 meters long, that allows visitors to appreciate the ship's enormous size. The museum presents the Yamato story with remarkable honesty, acknowledging both the engineering achievement and the strategic miscalculation it represented. Exhibits include personal belongings of crew members, technical drawings, and testimonies from survivors. It's a place of remembrance rather than glorification. The Yamato's cultural legacy in Japan remains complex. The ship appears regularly in films, anime, and literature, often reimagined as a symbol of both technological prowess and tragic sacrifice. For some, it represents the courage of men who fought knowing they would lose. For others, it symbolizes the danger of hubris and the cost of leadership failures. These interpretations coexist without resolution, reflecting Japan's broader struggle to process its wartime history. The lessons from the Yamato's story transcend World War II naval history. Military planners still study it as a cautionary tale about preparing for the last war rather than the next one. The danger isn't just building the wrong weapon, it's investing so heavily in a strategic vision that contradicting evidence gets ignored. Japan saw carriers devastating Pearl Harbor, saw their own carriers destroyed at Midway, yet continued believing battleships would decide the Pacific War's outcome. Institutional momentum and emotional investment in doctrine can blind even intelligent people to obvious reality. The wreckage lying on the ocean floor serves as a monument to 3,000 men who died and to the empire that sent them. It's a reminder that confidence, no matter how well armored or how sincerely held, offers no protection against the fundamental forces reshaping the world. Some truths cannot be denied forever, and sometimes the cost of learning them is measured in thousands of lives and the dreams of nations.